Commercial Pilot Qualifications, Task 1 Alpha, represents the foundational understanding required for any commercial pilot regarding their legal privileges and operational limitations. This task demands comprehensive knowledge of multiple federal aviation regulations, their interconnections, and practical applications. The complexity arises not from any single regulation, but from the intricate web of definitions, exemptions, and operational boundaries that define the legal scope of commercial pilot operations. This is going to be a presentation made by myself, Ivan Sworowski-Rondeau, and
Reseski. I'm a single-I, double-I, and professor at Embry-Riddle. The fundamental challenge lies in understanding what constitutes legal commercial operations versus activities that require additional certification under Parts 119, 121, or 135. Many commercial pilot applicants fail this area because they either overstate their limitations or fail to recognize the boundaries that separate legal pilot services from unauthorized commercial operator activities.
Primary Regulatory Framework 14 Code of Federal Regulations 61-133 Commercial Pilot Privileges and Limitations. The regulation states that a person who holds a commercial pilot certificate may act as pilot in command of an aircraft carrying persons or property for compensation or hire, provided the person is qualified in accordance with this part and with the applicable parts of this chapter that apply to the operation. This foundational regulation establishes the basic privilege, but immediately introduces complexity through its reference to applicable parts of this chapter.
The term "this chapter" refers to Chapter 1 of Title 14, which encompasses virtually all aviation regulations. However, the practical application focuses on understanding which applicable parts actually govern commercial pilot operations. The regulation creates a gateway that permits compensation for piloting services while simultaneously requiring compliance with operational limitations found elsewhere in the regulatory framework.
Under 14 CFR 61-133, Alpha 1, commercial pilots may carry persons or property for compensation or hire. This privilege is not absolute, but is conditioned upon qualification under Part 61 and compliance with applicable operational requirements. The regulation deliberately avoids defining specific operational scenarios, instead creating a framework that must be interpreted in conjunction with other regulations. The second privilege under 61-133 Alpha 2 permits commercial pilots to act as pilot in command for hire in operations not involving the carriage of persons or property for compensation or hire. This provision covers scenarios such as ferry flights, aircraft delivery, and other non-passenger, non-cargo operations where the pilot is compensated for their services rather than for transportation.
14 CFR 119.1 Applicability and the Commercial Operator Framework. Part 119 applies to each person operating or intending to operate civil aircraft as an air carrier or commercial operator, or both, in air commerce or when common carriage is not involved, in operations of any U.S. registered civil airplane, or power lift with specific seat configurations. Understanding this applicability is crucial because it defines when additional certification beyond a commercial pilot certificate is required. The requirements of Part 119 apply to both air carriers and other commercial operators. Part 119 provides the process for obtaining and maintaining an operating certificate. This distinction is fundamental to understanding when a commercial pilot is operating within their certificate privileges versus when they are conducting unauthorized commercial operator activities. Part 119 establishes the certification requirements for operations that go beyond individual pilot services. When a person or entity provides both the aircraft and the pilot as a package to customers, they are functioning as a commercial operator and must obtain appropriate certification. This distinction forms the cornerstone of legal commercial pilot operations.
The critical exemptions under 14 CFR 119 ECHO define specific operations that do not require commercial operator certification, even when conducted for compensation. These exemptions are crucial for commercial pilots because they represent areas where pilot services can be legally provided without triggering the 119 requirements. The exemptions include student instruction, representing one of the largest categories of commercial pilot employment. Flight instructors providing training services are specifically exempt from commercial operator requirements, regardless of whether they use their own aircraft or aircraft provided by students or flight school. This exemption recognizes the educational nature of flight instruction and distinguishes it from transportation services. Non-stop aerial tours constitute another significant exemption. though this area requires careful analysis. The regulation permits certain aerial tour operations with a commercial operator certification, but the specific limitations and requirements must be thoroughly understood. Tours that involve multiple stops or that function as transportation rather than sightseeing may not qualify for this exemption. Ferry and training flights are exempt from conducting for specific purposes related to aircraft positioning or crew training. Ferry flights involve moving aircraft from one location to another for maintenance, delivery, or repositioning purposes. Training flights encompass a broad category of operations focused on pilot proficiency or aircraft familiarization rather than transportation.
Aerial work operations represent a specialized category that includes activities such as power line patrol, pipeline inspection, aerial photography, surveying, and agricultural applications. These operations are distinguished from transportation services because the aircraft serves as a platform for work activities rather than as a means of convenience.
Advisory Circular 12012 Alpha, Private Carriage versus Common Carriage. This advisory circular provides essential definitions and guidance that do not represent or appear elsewhere in the regulations. The FAA acknowledges that the concepts of common carriage and private carriage are common law terms that should be understood without specific regulatory definition. However, the practical application requires detailed understanding of these concepts.
The advisory circular establishes that common carriage requires 4 elements: holding out to serve the public, transportation from place to place, for compensation or hire, and as a regular business operation. The absence of any single element removes an operation from the common carriage category. This framework is crucial for commercial pilots because it defines when their activities might inadvertently cross into unlawful commercial operator territory.
Private carriage, by contrast, lacks one or more elements of common carriage. A commercial pilot conducting private carriage operations typically serves specific customers rather than the general public, and may not operate on a regular schedule, or may provide services other than point-to-point transportation. Understanding this distinction allows commercial pilots to structure their operations legally while maximizing their earning potential. Definitional framework and terminology. Compensation beyond monetary payment. The FAA's interpretation of compensation extends far beyond direct monetary payment. Compensation includes any benefit, advantage, or favor received by the pilot that they did not previously possess. This broad interpretation encompasses flight time building, business favors, reciprocal arrangements, goods, services, and any other form of valuable consideration. The flight time building issue represents a particular challenge for commercial pilots. When a pilot accepts a flight opportunity primarily to build flight time, the FAA may consider the flight time itself as compensation. This interpretation can complicate expense sharing arrangements and volunteer flying activities. Commercial pilots must carefully evaluate whether their participation in any flight constitutes compensated activity under this broad definition. Business relationships create additional compensation concerns. When a pilot provides flying services in connection with other business arrangements, even indirect benefits may constitute compensation. For example, a pilot who provides flying services to a business partner in exchange for favorable terms in an unrelated business deal is receiving compensation for the flying services.
Air carrier versus commercial operator distinctions. Air carriers engage in air transportation, which involves interstate, overseas, or foreign transportation by aircraft, or the transportation of mail by aircraft. The air carrier category encompasses the major airlines and other operations that provide scheduled or charter transportation services to the public. Air carriers must obtain certification under Part 119 and operate under Part 121 or 135, depending on their operational scope. Commercial operations engage in operations for compensation or hire, but may not necessarily provide air transportation services. Commercial operators might include aerial work providers, specialized charter services, or other operations that use aircraft for commercial purposes without engaging in common carriage. Like air carriers, commercial operators must obtain Part 119 certification when their operations exceed the scope of individual pilot services. The distinction becomes crucial when evaluating whether specific operations require additional certification. A pilot providing services to an air carrier or commercial operator as an employee or contractor is operating within their commercial pilot privileges. However, a pilot who attempts to function as an unlicensed air carrier or commercial operator violates federal aviation regulations.
Air commerce and transportation definitions. Air commerce encompasses interstate, overseas, or foreign air commerce for transportation by aircraft or the transportation of mail by aircraft. This definition establishes the jurisdictional basis for many FAA regulations and helps determine when specific operational requirements apply. Air transportation specifically involves interstate, overseas, or foreign transportation by aircraft or mail transportation by aircraft. The transportation element distinguishes air transportation from other commercial aircraft operations. When commercial pilots provide air transportation services, they must ensure that they are operating within the appropriate regulatory framework. Understanding these definitions helps commercial pilots evaluate whether their proposed operations fall within their certificate privileges or require additional certification. Operations that constitute air transportation or air commerce may trigger Part 119 requirements depending on the specific circumstances and operational structure.
Practical application and operational scenarios. Legal commercial pilot operations. Corporate pilot positions represent one of the most common forms of commercial pilot employment. When a pilot is employed by a corporation to fly the company's aircraft for business purposes, they are operating well within their commercial pilot privileges. The pilot is providing piloting services only, while the corporation provides the aircraft and determines the operational requirements. This arrangement avoids commercial operator issues because the pilot is not holding out services to the public or providing transportation as a business. Contract pilot services allow commercial pilots to provide their services to aircraft owners who need qualified pilots for specific flights. These arrangements work legally when the pilot provides only piloting services while the aircraft owner retains operational control and provides the aircraft. Contract pilots must ensure that they are not inadvertently functioning as a commercial operator by making operational decisions or holding out services to the general public.
Aircraft delivery and ferry services provide opportunities for commercial pilots to utilize their privileges while serving the aviation industry. Ferry pilots transport aircraft from manufacturers to dealers between maintenance facilities or for owners who cannot personally fly the aircraft. These operations typically qualify for Part 119 exemptions and represent legitimate commercial pilot activities.
Flight instruction represents the largest category of commercial pilot employment and provides a clear example of legal commercial operations. Flight instructors provide professional services that are specifically exempt from commercial operator requirements. Instructors can legally hold out their services to the public, advertise their qualifications, and accept compensation for instruction without triggering Part 119 requirements.
Prohibited operations without proper certification. Charter-type services represent one of the most common violations of commercial pilot privileges. When a pilot advertises flights to the general public using their own aircraft, they are functioning as an unlicensed air taxi operator. This activity requires Part 135 certification because it involves holding out transportation services to the public for compensation. The pilot is providing both the aircraft and piloting services, which exceeds individual commercial pilot privileges. On-demand transportation services require a similar problem, with pilots attempt to provide point-to-point transportation using their own aircraft. Even when services are not advertised to the general public, regular transportation services for compensation may constitute commercial operator activities. The key factors include whether the operation serves the pilot's business purposes or primarily serves passenger transportation needs.
Systematic sightseeing operations may exceed the scope of Part 119 exemptions when they function as a regular business activity. While certain aerial tours are exempt from Part 119 requirements, operations that become systematic transportation services rather than educational or recreational activities may require commercial operator certification.
The holding out analysis. The concept of holding out creates significant confusion among pilots and commercial operators because it applies differently depending on the type of services being offered. Commercial pilots can legally hold out their privileges and piloting services through advertising, business cards, websites, and other promotional activities. This type of holding out is not only legal but essential for the building of a successful commercial pilot career. The prohibited form of holding out involves advertising transportation services to the general public without appropriate certification. When a pilot holds out both aircraft and piloting services as a package, they are functioning as an unlicensed commercial operator. The distinction lies in what services are being advertised and to whom they are being offered. Holding out can occur through various means, including direct advertising, word of mouth, promotion, internet postings, or even making aircraft available at airports in a manner that suggests availability for hire. The FAA evaluates holding out based on the totality of circumstances rather than specific advertising methods.
Regulatory compliance strategies. Structural approaches to legal operations. Commercial pilots can structure their operations to remain within legal boundaries while maximizing their professional opportunities. The key principle involves separating pilot services from aircraft provision. When pilots provide only their professional services while customers provide aircraft, the arrangement typically remains within commercial pilot privileges. Dry lease arrangements allow aircraft owners to lease aircraft to pilots or other operators while retaining ownership. Under a dry lease, the lessee provides operational control and crew, while the lessor provides only the aircraft. Commercial pilots operating under dry lease arrangements must ensure that they maintain operational control and do not function as agents of the aircraft owner in ways that would create commercial operator relationships. Employment relationships provide the clearest path to legal commercial operations. When pilots are employed by aircraft owners, corporations, or flight training organizations, their activities fall clearly within commercial pilot privileges. Employment relationships eliminate concerns about holding out and commercial operator activities because the pilot is providing services to a specific employer rather than to the public.
Documentation and record-keeping requirements. Commercial pilots must maintain detailed records of their operations to demonstrate compliance with applicable regulations. Documentation should clearly establish the nature of each operation, the source of operational control, compensation arrangements, and the regulatory basis for conducting the operation. Proper documentation becomes crucial if questions arise about the legality of specific operations. Operational control documentation should clearly establish who has authority over flight operations, including route selection, scheduling, aircraft maintenance, and crew requirements. When commercial pilots provide services under contract, agreements should clearly specify the division of responsibilities and establish that the pilot is providing only professional services. Compensation records must accurately reflect all forms of payment or benefit received from flying services. Given the FAA's broad interpretation of compensation, pilots should document not only direct payments but also any indirect benefits, business arrangements, or other consideration received in connection with flying activities.
Risk management and compliance monitoring. Commercial pilots should regularly evaluate their operations against regulatory requirements to ensure continued compliance. The regulatory environment continues to evolve, and operations that were previously acceptable may require modification as interpretations change or new regulations are implemented. Professional consultation with aviation attorneys or regulatory specialists can help commercial pilots navigate complex operational scenarios. When operations approach regulatory boundaries or involve novel arrangements, professional guidance can help ensure compliance while maximizing commercial opportunities. Industry involvement through professional organizations, training programs, and regulatory update services help commercial pilots stay current with changing requirements and enforcement trends. The commercial pilot community benefits from shared knowledge about acceptable practices and regulatory interpretations.
Inadvertent commercial operator activities. Many commercial pilots inadvertently exceed their certificate privileges by gradually expanding their operations beyond individual pilot services. This expansion often occurs through customary requests for additional services or through efforts to maximize revenue from aircraft ownership. Pilots must regularly evaluate whether their operations remain within commercial pilot privileges or have evolved into commercial operator activities. Package deals that combine aircraft rental with pilot services often create commercial operator issues. When pilots own or control aircraft and offer combined packages to customers, they may be functioning as unlicensed charter operators. The solution involves clearly separating aircraft provision from pilot services or obtaining appropriate commercial operator certification. Customer relationship management becomes crucial when pilots serve repeat customers or develop systematic transportation services. Regular service to specific customer does not automatically create commercial operator issues, but pilots must ensure that they are not holding out transportation services or functioning as systematic transportation providers.
Enforcement trends and regulatory priorities. The FAA has increased enforcement activity related to unauthorized commercial operations. particularly in response to online platforms that facilitate aircraft sharing and pilot services. Commercial pilots must be aware that the traditional enforcement approaches may not address modern technological platforms and service delivery methods. Economic analysis plays an increasing role in FAA enforcement decisions. Operations that generate significant revenue or that systematically provide transportation services receive greater scrutiny than occasional pilot services. Commercial pilots should evaluate their operations from an economic perspective to identify potential enforcement risks. Technology platforms create new challenges for regulatory compliance as they may facilitate arrangements that appear similar to legal pilot services but that actually constitute commercial operator activities. Commercial pilots using online platforms or mobile applications should carefully evaluate the nature of the services being provided and the relationship with customers.
Advanced regulatory considerations, international operations and cross-border issues. Commercial pilots conducting international operations face additional regulatory complexity because they must comply with both U.S. regulations and requirements of foreign aviation authorities. International operations may trigger different certification requirements or operational limitations that do not apply to domestic operators. Cross-border pilots services may involve complex legal arrangements that affect the regulatory analysis. When U.S. commercial pilots provide services involving foreign aircraft or foreign customers, they must consider the applicable regulatory framework and ensure that their activities remain within their certificate privileges. Treaty obligations and international agreements may affect the availability of certain commercial pilot privileges in international operations. Pilots conducting cross-border operations should research applicable agreements and ensure compliance with all relevant requirements.
Emerging technologies and regulatory evolution. Advanced aircraft technologies, including sophisticated autopilot systems, remotely piloted aircraft, and electric aircraft, may affect the regulatory analysis for commercial pilot operations. As technology evolves, the definition of pilot services and the regulatory requirements for various operations may change. Urban air mobility and advanced air mobility concepts are driving regulatory changes that may affect commercial pilot privileges and limitations. Pilots should monitor regulatory developments in these areas to understand how emerging operations may create new opportunities or restrictions. Digital platforms and blockchain technologies may create new methods for arranging pilot services and aircraft operations. Commercial pilots should evaluate new technologies and platforms to ensure that their use remains consistent with regulatory requirements and does not inadvertently create commercial operator relationships.
To sum up, commercial pilot qualifications, Task 1 Alpha, requires a comprehensive understanding of multiple interconnected regulations, their practical applications, and the complex relationships between different types of commercial aviation operators. Success in this area requires more than memorization of specific regulations and demands analytical skills to evaluate operational scenarios and determine appropriate regulatory compliance strategies. The fundamental principle remains that commercial pilots can provide piloting services for compensation while ensuring that they do not inadvertently function as unlicensed commercial operators. This distinction requires careful attention to our operational structure, customer relationships, and delivery methods. Commercial pilots who understand these distinctions can build successful careers while maintaining regulatory compliance. Ongoing education and professional development remain essential for commercial pilots operating in an evolving regulatory environment. The regulatory framework continues to adapt to new technologies, business models, and industry needs. Pilots who maintain current knowledge and seek professional guidance when needed are best positioned to maximize their commercial opportunities while avoiding enforcement actions. The complexity of commercial pilot qualification Task 1 Alpha reflects the sophisticated regulatory environment in which commercial pilots operate. This complexity should not discourage commercial pilot career development, but rather emphasize the importance of thorough professional preparation and an ongoing regulatory compliance efforts. Commercial pilots who master these concepts are well prepared for successful careers in commercial aviation. Thank you for your time.